Hey there, this is Anthony Corelli with the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. Just wanted to remind you that we are on hiatus getting prepared for season 3, but we didn't want to leave you without content. So tonight, we're going to air an episode that previously debuted in bonus episode format. So, if you're not a Patreon member, please consider subscribing. At the $2 level, you'll get access to the Freedom from the Struggle podcast normal episodes one day early, as well as the back catalog. At the $5 level, you'll have access to all of the bonus content that we do on this podcast. So please enjoy tonight's episode, and may God bring you peace and bless you throughout this week. Hello, and thank you for joining us on this bonus episode of the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Corelli. In tonight's episode, we're going to cover the possession of a man named Maurice Thierault. Now, this is a story that some of you may have heard of, and some of you haven't. And in order to tell this story, we're going to go back to the very beginning. But before we do that, I have to address one issue. Some of you may have heard this name because this name and this character has been seen in 2 movies from the Conjuring universe called The Nun, Parts 1 and 2. However, the real story of Maurice Thierault is very different. So unfortunately, if you tuned in to hear the story of Maurice Thierault, thinking that you were going to hear the story of The Nun, I apologize. That's not what you're going to get here. But we are going to cover the real story of this man whose life was not only incredible and tragic, but it's also a story of one of the first videotaped possessions in our country. And so I actually think that the real story of Maurice Thierault is much more interesting than the story of the nun, but that's just me. So let's get started. Maurice was born to French Canadian parents in St. Agatha, Maine on July 13th, 1936. Now, his father, Maxim, was a very abusive man. And, I think a lot of times we hear that term abusive, and it could mean many different things. But I think you're going to find when I call Maxim abusive, it is to a level that we probably can't even really comprehend. You see, Maxim had 15 children, which Maurice being the oldest, and he was extremely physically abusive. He would beat the children often, daily. He would beat them with the belt until they bled. And as Maurice got older, because he was the oldest, he became the object of a lot of Maxim's abuse, to the point where he would often try to avoid Maxim. And when he was working out in the fields, as early as 5 years old, if he made one mistake, he would be beat severely. But in order to really show you the extent of the depravity of this man, Maxim, you have to understand this vital part of the story. As Maurice got older, he was out in the fields and in the barns a lot with his father, and was just working basically. And one time he stumbled upon Maxim, and this is what I would say a trigger warning here. If you are somebody who is sensitive about topics of bestiality or abuse to animals, you probably want to skip forward about a minute. So again, Maurice stumbles upon his father having sex with an animal. And because Maxim is exposed, his son basically witnesses the act in an effort to not only abuse, but to implicate his son. He forces Maurice to do the same. Now, you can imagine what this does to a child in terms of damage, long term damage. The level of depravity here I could only describe as one of the ultimate forms of evil. This man, Maxim, obviously to me was demonized. Although you won't hear that in any other parts of the story, I think it's obvious that if somebody is in that level of depravity, they are under the influence of a very demonic creature. But as we continue through the story, Maurice, because of this episode and all of the other abuse, he is a very angry child. And he was described in early life as well as later in life to be a pretty gentle guy, but he also had this angry side of him. And you can imagine because of this abuse and because of his life circumstances, it's not really that far fetched. But one day in his anger, was known to shout out, "I would rather work for the devil than you," to his father. And so, for those of us who work in the deliverance ministry realm, it's easy to see that this is an invitation. This is a permission that was given to a spirit or spirits in that moment of his life. And it doesn't necessarily mean from that moment he was instantly, the person that we'll read about later in this story, but it was the beginning of a very, very, very massive destruction of this man. So as he screams, "I would rather work for the devil than you," something amazing and scary actually occurs, because it said that shortly after that, Maurice was able to do the work of two grown men. All of a sudden, he had this enormous strength. He was outworking everybody. He was lifting heavy objects. And it was easy to see that this invitation that he had made, although, one that maybe seemed just out of anger, something must have entered him, after that time. Now, by the time he was 15, his father forced him to drop out of school. And so you can imagine the tension between these two. And Maurice was known to be very fond of his mother and very full of hate towards his father. So at age 21, with no schooling, just work on the farm, he decided to leave home. And he was known to work in factories, traveled a lot. He was married 3 times, but during his first marriage, it was said that when he would argue with his first wife, blood would pour out of the walls. This is what she reports and what he reports. He would have suicidal and homicidal fits of rage and then claim he didn't remember. So he had lots of issues in regards to his interpersonal relationships, just struggling to pay the bills, so on and so forth. Now, during his arguments and sometimes even just sitting around, he was known to bleed from his eyes and would go into trances. Now, later on in life, after much chaos, he meets a woman named Nancy, who would become his third wife. And she describes their marriage as 8 years of living in hell. And this was in a town called Warren, Massachusetts. By this time, Maurice had decided he was going to work as a farmer, and he sold produce on the side of the road at a roadside stand. And he was actually known by the nickname of Frenchie. And so the townspeople knew him as kind of this gentle farmer. They actually called him Frenchie Tomato because he had a sign that said tomatoes on his stand. And so that just became his local nickname. But they knew him to be gentle, but it didn't take long for the rumors around this small community that although he was gentle in the public, that his family life may be a little more tumultuous than what he appeared to be on the outside. So in 1981, Maurice found out that his father had killed his mother and then himself. And so, although Maurice was known to be somebody who had all of this chaos in his life, this event seemed to bring out another level of the paranormal. During his grieving, it was noted that strange things started to happen. And Nancy actually said that he had a side of him that was pure evil, and that he would get a look in his eye and abuse the family, including her children. Now, Nancy reached out to a priest by the name of Father Boyer, and upon meeting them, he had actually read a book by the infamous Ed and Lorraine Warren. And so he introduced Nancy and Maurice to the Warrens. Now, the Warrens are very controversial figures. They are well known in the paranormal world, and they have just as many fans as they do skeptics. And a lot of people would consider them grifters. Other people would say they're pioneers in the paranormal field. But what we do know is that uh, Nancy actually doesn't have a whole lot bad to say about the Warrens, unlike some of the other families that worked with the Warrens. Sometimes the stories that's told in the movies and in the books doesn't line up with what they said. However, Nancy seemed to really feel that Ed and Lorraine Warren were instrumental in helping them, at least for a short time. So during this time, it was witnessed that objects were moving around, things were being lifted, there was sounds that were unnatural. They witnessed Maurice bleeding from his eyes and actually crosses forming on his body, upside down crosses. Sometimes he would have messages forming on his back in French, at places that he couldn't reach. Nancy actually reported that one time while in the greenhouse on their farm, she saw a 2x4 lift off the ground and fly across the space and hit Maurice in the head. So there is a lot of skeptics that would say that Maurice, and they say that there's even witnesses that say that Maurice would put fake blood on the corners of his eyes. But Nancy, the woman who endured this, is very convinced that these were paranormal activities. And so, witnessing a 2x4 fly across the room and hit him in the head and knock him out, it would be hard to fake that, of course. Saying your eyes are bleeding and when nobody's looking, sticking blood, fake blood in the corner of your eyes is very different than nobody else being in the space and a board lifting off the ground and hitting Maurice in the head. That's a completely different thing. In addition, Maurice was said to lift his tractor with one hand and lifting other heavy objects at the same time with no effort. And again, skeptics, have said that the tractor was lifted up with some sort of jack system and was propped up on a stand, and there he was able to move the tractor around because of leverage. Now, of course, these are things that we don't know because we weren't there, but I'm just kind of giving you both sides of the story in terms of what people see. One of the things that is very, very difficult to dismiss is there are many witnesses that say that Maurice had a doppelganger and that he could actually be in two places at once. And the Warrens, as well as the Thieraults and some authors, wrote a book called Satan's Harvest. And in that book, you will hear stories of how they would see Maurice in the barn and then he would be in the house and vice versa in a time frame where he couldn't have been in both spaces. So what I'm saying is it's not like he was in the barn and then 3 minutes later they saw him in the house and nobody watched him walk in. It was more like he was in the barn, you turn around and he's standing there. Now, again, skeptics can try to debunk this by people's recollection in time, but I want to tell you that these instances, for the people that are involved in them, they're often patronized or ridiculed for saying that they've seen these doppelganger creatures. But who better to know, who, excuse me, who you're dealing with than the people that would know you the most? So if I say I saw Maurice in one place and then another, that is not something that you should put any credibility into because I don't know Maurice. But if his wife says that she's seen him in 2 places at the same time, that's completely different. Now, in my first book, The Struggle, I wrote of a story in the book where a father who is estranged from the house and is not supposed to be in contact with the family is seen in the window of the house as the wife and the children pull up. And because he's not supposed to be there, the wife is very upset, but the children who haven't seen him in a while are happy. So they run into the house to find him and he's not there. So she calls him and he answers the phone and he's actually at his mother's house and verifies that through his mother's testimony. And so in the book, which is a fictional story using some real life events, that's at the point where the main female character realizes that there's a lot more than meets the eye in terms of the paranormal activity. Now, I took that from a real life story of a family that I dealt with. And I dealt with a family who was having some trouble with an abusive father. And because the father was not allowed to be in the home because of a restraining order, the father had not seen his children for a while. And the family actually called me to pray with them because on 3 separate occasions, the family came home and they witnessed the father inside the house looking out the window. However, when they investigated the house, the father was nowhere to be found. And the mother actually phoned the police because she was upset with him because of the abuse and turned him in on all 3 separate occasions. However, the police were able to verify his whereabouts, including video surveillance. And because you had a wife and some teenage children, one of them was not a teenager, but the other 2 were, so there was 3 children. They were unable to have an understanding of what was going on because it wasn't just once. And so the first time they thought, well, maybe it was somebody else and we thought it looked like him, but they were again second guessing themselves. Who better to know what he looked like than them? The 3 children plus the wife who were the closest to him would see him looking out the window, they would know immediately it was him. It was to the point that the wife was actually asking his mother if he had a twin that she had never mentioned. That's how convinced they were. And so the police began to wonder if she was making up stories to get him in trouble to gain full custody of the children. And the only thing that probably saved her was the fact that the children said they also witnessed it. And so, with praying for this family and explaining the concept of how demons can be deceptive in ways that we can't comprehend, we were able to kind of help them gain some protection as well as kind of turn their lives over to Jesus. Um, Although they were professing Christians, they were not actually, believers in terms of being born again. So from that, they came to that point, and unfortunately, the story does not include a reconciliation of the family, but it does include a happy ending in regards to the family no longer having any paranormal activity because as you can imagine, the doppelganger wasn't the first instance. This was farther progressed into their paranormal activity, which probably had a lot to do with the conflict of the family and so on and so forth. But we're getting a little far off topic. So let me get back to Maurice here. So there was another time where Ed and Lorraine Warren and their team actually followed Maurice to the graveyard where he knelt down to pray for his father. And Lorraine Warren herself stated that he was struck under the chin by an unseen force and was knocked backwards. So let me paint that picture again. Maurice, although full of hatred for his father, is still at the gravesite praying for his father when an unseen force, like a fist, she described, literally struck him under the chin, lifted him up and backwards in front of not only the Warrens, but their team. And so they were convinced that this was no doubt a possession. So they contacted a bishop by the name of Timothy Harrington, and through some evidentiary processes, they were able to have an exorcism authorized. And there was a couple of attempts. One attempt, for example, they tried to take him to a mass, and this mass was held in a church that had a very long concrete staircase that went up into the church. And it was known and seen by multiple people that as he got towards the top of the staircase, he was flipped up into the air and thrown down a flight of steps that were concrete and landed at the bottom. So there was no doubt that there was something going on. However, the church had also stated that they needed to pursue psychological help as a way to ensure that this wasn't just him. And so that very thing was done. Maurice was actually admitted into a state mental hospital and he was tested. And of course, as you can imagine, he had no diagnoses. Nothing was determined to be wrong with his mental health. And so they proceeded with the exorcism, which was performed by Bishop Robert McKenna. And if you're somebody who's into the paranormal, you have heard that name before, especially working with the Warrens. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, there is actual video of this exorcism. And I want to take the time to describe this to you a little bit because it's something that you can see, and it's something that many skeptics have tried to debunk. But if you watch the video, you can see that his face begins to change. Now, keep in mind that Maurice is sitting in a chair with people around him, and the camera is fixed on him. And so as you see his face change, there is evidence that there was no touching of his face. There was no maneuvers that he could have done the things that would cause what you see in the video. So his face begins to change in a way that I can only describe as a metamorphosis. And you would have to see this yourself to understand what I'm saying. And in a subtle way, if you just watched the end of the video or saw a still photo of the aftermath, you would say, well, that could be staged, it could be makeup. But as you're watching the video, you can see the transformation. His skin begins to bubble, like blisters bubbling on his skin. And how you would fake that, I'm not real sure. A deep crack forms on his forehead, kind of above his left eye, in a way that is not a scratch, and it forms literally in view of the camera. And I don't really like to use the word literally a lot, even though it slips out of my mind, because sometimes we're exaggerating. It's very, you know, kind of hyperbolic. But in this case, I mean literally. In this case, what I mean is during this process, a crack forms on his head and begins to bleed. And perhaps the most shocking part of it all, in terms of a visual, his eyes begin to look like a serpent's eyes. And you can see this in the video. As the exorcism progressed, you see his eyes roll up in the back of his head and he passes out. And when he comes to, he states he feels better, and it seems like the demon had been expelled. had been exorcised because everything seemed to kind of creep back to normal. And he was fine for a while, but then the demon returned. And it's hard to say from a bystander point of view for something that happened when I was 10 years old. However, it appears to me that the demon may have never left. But we learn in scriptures that if we expel a demon and it leaves and it decides to come back and see if the house has been put in order, and the house meaning you, the body that it was dwelling, and it sees it swept up and cleaned up, but it's empty, then it says that it'll actually bring back 7 more worse than itself. So I would say that it's likely that the exorcism may have worked, but that Maurice made no efforts to fill his life with God. And although the Catholic Church was, involved, and Maurice seemed to be somebody who would pray at times, he doesn't appear to me somebody who's um, a person of faith or a person of transformation, maybe a person of religion, but definitely not somebody who's made a change or who has, you know, become a new creation in his salvation. Now, about 6 months later, Maurice was actually arrested for rape. And I say it that bluntly because what else can you say? So they're hoping and praying that he's better. And it seemed like he was for a while. But in a very short period of time, he does something heinous. And the officers who arrest him state that they see Maurice bleeding from his eyes. He was speaking in a weird language, which some people say was Latin backwards, but I don't really have a lot of evidence of that. So I'm trying to leave out a lot of hearsay, but that's something that may be important. And then he was said to make a bunch of threatening statements to the point where the officer got up and splashed holy water on him to make him calm down. Now, this sexual assault occurred towards his stepdaughter, but in a kind of weird twist of fate, the stepdaughter decided not to continue with the charges. And it's basically rumored that she didn't do it because she knew that it was the demon, that it wasn't her stepfather. And so the family seemed to be aware of his demonic possession and still considered him a human at times. So it seems to me like the family believed that there was a good guy and then there was the possessed guy, and they were trying to still help the good guy, even though he had done some heinous things to them, not only at his arrest, but before that as well. So Nancy reached back out to the Warrens and they continued to try to pray with the family. And the family decided that because of the controversy in their little town, that they would sell, or it was actually a lease, that they would get out of the lease of their farm and move to a smaller farm in a town called Watley. Now, before they could formulate a plan, things went very, very wrong. Now, when I say very, very wrong, I'm going to describe the ending of this trauma for the family, and it is again very graphic. So I'm going to give you another trigger warning here because there's some depictions of violence. Now, on this particular night where everything would come to a head, Nancy came home and was ambushed. Maurice was waiting in the basement, and when she came in, he physically attacked her. He beat her, and when she tried to run, he went out into the street and shot her in the arm. And then he pulled her back in the house. And as you hear Ed Warren tell the story, as well as Nancy, you see that it is very likely that Maurice had some semblance of his self that was still fighting, because the way it's described, he was going to shoot Nancy again. And through a conflict and through conversation, he told her, "You're gonna remember this forever." Then he put the gun in his mouth and blew his head off. And when you hear Nancy tell the story, you there there's a there's still a lot of pain in her eyes, and a lot of these interviews are very old, so I can't speak for her later years in life, but I can say that those initial interviews, there was a lot of pain. And she stated that she actually said the word amen when he shot himself. And speculation, or at least conjecture on my part, would say that she felt that it was finally over. And not only for herself, but I probably also believe that the part of her that cared for this man, because she must have to stay, believed that it was over for him as well. And so, as that part of the story ends, you see Nancy and the family just try to continue on to have a normal life. And then we kind of lose them in history, which I think is great because we don't want them to be, to continue to be in the spotlight for something so horrific. So I'm going to once again kind of address the skeptics of this story because they're out there. And I'm gonna kind of speak on skeptics in general just for a second. I'm somebody who listens to a lot of different types of podcasts and programming and stories, and I do a lot of research. And this research stems from being somebody who has always had the ability to see demons. And because of that, I get a lot of criticism from, I would call, religious people, Christians. I shouldn't be watching horror movies. I'm inviting demons into my life. It's my fault that I always see demons. And, I most of the time just politely kind of hear them out and then don't really try to make too much effort to explain myself because, again, for those of you who know my story, my first memories at 4 years old are seeing demons. Now, what was I doing at 4 years old to deserve that? I wasn't involved in ritualistic cult behavior. I wasn't worshiping the devil. Because of my ethnic history, we are people that we would consider born Catholic because that's just part of the culture of the Roman Catholic Church. And there's certain ethnic backgrounds that you're just basically Catholic. And so I had a family that, although weren't church going, definitely believed in God and prayed to God and celebrated holidays and Lent and Ash Wednesday and all of those types of things. So there was nothing in my family from the religious side that would cause me to welcome demons into my life. And I can also point to some behaviors of family members who maybe were demonized themselves, and I was just a kind of a bystander to their demonic turmoil. However, as I've progressed through life, it's become abundantly clear to me that God gave me that in order to help people. And of course, skeptics would say, "Did God tell you that specifically?" Well, he did, but you're not going to believe it. But that's what happened. And so I I am somebody who, if I'm honest, gets a little frustrated sometimes with skeptics, not because they're critical of me. I could care less. If you listeners knew the attacks and emails and social media posts and things that we get here, I mean, I've seen and heard atrocious things that are so evil that it's shocking. And of course, we try to laugh because we're talking about demons and these people attack us, and we often say, well, we must be stirring up demons for a stranger to scroll by a post and decide that they have to do a 30-minute attack on us that they don't even know who we are. So there's a spiritual component there. But I digress. The reason that skeptics bother me is they often minimize what people went through. So there's no heart in these people. And I shouldn't say that as an absolute. There's no heart in many of these people. So if somebody is saying that they are watching a doppelganger and it's terrifying them and it's affecting their feelings of safety and security and terror, and they feel that their lives are in danger, and a skeptic comes and says, well, you're not seeing a doppelganger, so stop believing that. Obviously, that isn't true. That's impossible. So let's talk about the reasons why you think you're seeing two people. Do you have a bad memory? Are you a drinker? Blah, 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 blah. And you see how in that skepticism, the person's feelings and emotions just fade away and it becomes an attack. Now, am I saying that we should believe everything we're told? Of course not. Am I saying that we should believe that um, everybody's telling us the truth and not try to find logical explanations? Of course not. But what I am saying is people's feelings should be paramount. And so if a woman is telling you that she watches a 2x4 lift off the ground and fly across the barn or the greenhouse to hit her husband in the head and knock him unconscious, and somebody says, well, she probably picked it up and hit him in the head. Well, what was the purpose of her story? Was her story to get attention? Was her story to because somebody accused her of a crime? And more importantly, what did Maurice say? Maurice said, yes, that happened. And skeptics seem to me, have an underlying fear that they're not in control of their universe. And so if these paranormal activities exist, then their belief that they know how the universe works and how the world works and how reality works is shattered. That's why they're always trying to shatter the beliefs of a Christian, because they think that if they find the holy grail of evidence, that they can shatter what we believe because it by nature proves them right. But none of us are God and none of us really know. And without getting down a political rabbit trail, because this topic has been covered politically, but I mean it spiritually, we have found ourselves in a place where truth doesn't seem to exist and everything is subjective to the person. But that can't be true and that can't exist. And so they've attacked religion or faith in terms of finding all of this, what I would call scientific evidence. And this is where it'll sound political, but I mean this spiritually. Trust the science. And that phrase is an oxymoron, it's contradictory. Science is about proving null hypotheses. It's about proving that what you think might be true is not. And if you can't, then it might be true. Science isn't about absolute blind trust. That's actually called religion or faith. So if somebody tells me to trust the science, and then later on in life that science was proven to be untrue, not only will I not trust the science, but I won't trust the messengers of that science. Science by nature should look like we've done everything we can to disprove this and we can't, at least at this time. And you remember that it's not that long ago in history where science stated that everything revolved around the earth. And if you said that the earth actually revolved around the sun, you could be put to death. And more importantly, if we want to get really technical, I don't know that the earth revolves around the sun. I don't know that the earth is flat or round. I know that I have to trust people's word because although I'm a pretty educated guy and I understand, trigonometry and, how the earth is spherical by, just by math, I don't really know. I'm trained in Christianity and in psychology. I'm not trained in physics and astronomy and those types of things. So trusting a lot. But when people all get together and try to tell us something, I don't think we really know to the extent of what we think we know. And as science has progressed, many things that we thought were right were wrong. How we treat diseases, how we used to put leeches on people and bloodlet people thinking that that was going to cure them, and finding out that infections and things like that are probably what killed these people. But that was the science at the time. And so these skeptics that come along and try to debunk every ounce of paranormal, they sometimes drive me crazy. Now, I think I can appreciate a healthy skepticism. And I also notice that most skeptics are atheists. And that intrigues me a little bit because there's skepticism and then there's a skeptic. And so think of how much these people put all their eggs in one basket. So they are actually saying that if paranormal things exist, then God must exist. See, I'm kind of shocked that most of these people don't say, "Well, there's a God, but paranormal things don't happen." Have you noticed that? And I'm sure you can probably find one or two if you really did a deep dive. But for the most part, people who are skeptics of paranormal are also not believers. And that should tell you something because there are many witnesses to this story, yet you can find massive amounts of skeptics, including some of the neighbors that say that, Maurice was kind of like a hoaxer, like a magician almost, that he could, make his eyes bleed with tricks, and the tractor was moved because he had it weighted on a balance. And were they there? No. They always say things like, well, it's known or it was heard. But when I look at Nancy in these interviews, and again, I've never met her, wouldn't know where she was if I honestly don't even know if she's still alive. I didn't research that part. But you see the sincerity in her. You see the struggle that they fought. You see that he was arrested for this heinous crime and that the family chose not to prosecute him because of some reason that they said was, we understood that he was under the influence of an evil entity. And so I want you to think about that a little bit because what we do here on this podcast is we try to suspend all disbelief and really only use a healthy amount of skepticism to make sure that there aren't normal explanations for things. I'll give you another little story real quick. I once upon a time went out to help a family who stated that they often would hear knocking at their house in the middle of the night. And then one child actually said, well, she's home a lot during the day and she hears it sometimes. And so a person who went with me, and she was and I will never mention her name because we want to keep her anonymous in terms of people trying to contact her because she's sort of on the back end of wanting to disappear into a retirement. But she actually went down in the basement and watched a pipe that didn't have a hanging bracket, and anytime the furnace would kick on, it would it was basically not a good system. It was very old. This pipe would bang back and forth a couple times. And so me and the husband actually got just a piece of wire and tied it up. And I told him, call me back in a couple of days. And of course, they hadn't heard anything. And I in no way was minimizing what they were doing, but it's obviously an instinct to look at the practical first. But what I didn't do was call them crazy. What I did notice is that the family seemed relatively healthy and they didn't have a lot of other paranormal claims. It was just the noise. And so there wasn't a whole lot of turmoil. Wasn't a whole lot of underlying issues, if you will, and I could see that. So by solving this one little problem, then I was able to move on and help other families and help this family, you know, kind of become skeptics in and of themselves, because what reasons would there have been to have paranormal activity in their home? And there didn't seem to be a lot. But on the same token, if that family would have had many other issues, we could have solved the banging pipe problem, but we would have stayed and helped them with the other problems, if that makes sense. And so this is a story that if you research, you will find a healthy amount of skeptics who are trying to disprove. Now, as somebody who is not very technically, savvy in terms of video, audio, I think some of you who have listened to this podcast from the beginning could tell you that I'm doing better and I still have a long way to go in terms of editing and sound quality, but I'm getting there. So I don't pretend to be somebody who would know for sure, but when you watch this video, and this is what I'm getting at, when you watch this video, it's pretty hard to debunk a slash. I would call it like a huge gap that forms in this man's forehead right on camera. Now, how many people would had to have been involved in order for that to happen? A lot. Now, the Warrens have been accused of staging things, so on and so forth, but to put out this kind of video that could still be scrutinized today would have been very foolish even back then, because there was enough skepticism and enough technology that video could be easily shown to be edited or altered or doctored in some way, and they can't. When you watch the bubbles form on his head, when you watch his eyes transform, and it's creepy. And for those of you who haven't seen demons, you probably wouldn't understand what those eyes look like. And if you saw them, you would say it's CGI. But I've seen eyes like that many, many times in my life. As a matter of fact, I've been asked on a handful of occasions, what do demons look like? And the demons that I see look sort of reptilian, but they're scaly, but they also have hair. And, I'm not sure how many people would describe them like that. And maybe that's how I see them. I don't really know, but I've seen them multiple times. And people say, well, is that biblical? And I tell them, well, doesn't the book of Revelation tell us that there will be these three entities that look like frogs that come? And think about what a frog looks like. They have those eyes, and their faces are shaped weird with big eyes, with slits for nose. And I've often said, I don't, I'm not shocked that people say that they see gray aliens, because it wouldn't take but a couple alterations from a sketch artist to make a gray alien look like the demons that I've seen. Although I wouldn't have classified them as the same being when you look at the facial structure and the eyes. And so you get into very technical kind of parapsychological philosophy here where, you know, can these beings appear to look different to some people and than others, and so on and so forth? And I would say that that's probably very true, that the devil himself can probably appear to look like many things, and so can demons. But if you see them in their rarest form, that may be different. And so these frog-like creatures, if you get a moment, take a look at some depictions, not the sketch artist gray aliens, but artist renditions with detail and shading, you'll see that these things are somewhat reptile looking with these big eyes. Now, if you put slits in those eyes, that would seem very serpent like or frog like. And of course, you can argue that theory on whether aliens are demons all day long, and that's a maybe another podcast episode down the road, but I actually believe that those are the aliens, and when aliens come, they'll wreak havoc, and that's why when you read in the book of Revelation that these 3 frog-like creatures will come. Well, to me, in our day and age, you can see that if these 3 quote unquote aliens came, they could cause a lot of harm because they've conditioned us now to believe that aliens are coming. And so just a food for thought there. Now let's get back to this story of Maurice. I consider this story pretty tragic because this young boy Maurice didn't really have a chance. And I get a lot of flack as well, especially if you listen to the podcast from 2 days ago. I interviewed a man who was in prison, and that I'm soft on sin, or I'm soft on people who have been in trouble with the law, whatever the case may be. Well, I'm not a saint, and nor do I believe anybody else is a saint in the truest fashion. We are sinners, and simultaneously we're saints because we're saved by grace through faith, and we've become a new creation. But we're not only people that are flawed, but we continue to be flawed as we struggle to become this new creation that God is continuously working on. So I'm not somebody who really lacks empathy for people, even ones who have committed heinous crimes. Now, with the same breath, I will also say that the things that Maurice did were atrocious and should have been convicted of and should have been punished for, not just the abuse he was arrested for, but for the other abuses that he did, for the physical abuse, the what would be considered domestic violence. All of those things should have been addressed well before they were. And so he is accountable. But on the same token, this young man witnessed things as a child and suffered abuses as a child that no child should ever have to suffer. And it often breaks my heart when demons can control a family in such a way. And I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning. His father, Maxim, seemed to be somebody who was massively demonized. I would consider possessed at a very high level, and probably was possessed for decades and decades and decades, as we see that he eventually killed his wife and then himself. So you can see that demonic influence that just continued to torment Maxim. And who knows from what decisions Maxim made or what things Maxim endured. But the demon continually repeats itself in a family if we're not careful. Because you see that Maurice also had sexual immorality in his life and eventually tried to kill his wife and then himself. So that cycle would have repeated. And psychologically, we say that very thing. Well, it's a cycle that repeated itself. But we don't often put the spiritual component to that to say, is there a force that has all the family secrets and all the family weaknesses that continues to try to tear this family apart with the same game plan for generation after generation and after generation? And I very much believe that's true here. I very much believe that Maurice was subject to massive ritualistic abuse at the hands of his father and struggled because people would say he was gentle. People would say that there was a good side of him, but he was also fighting the demon or demons that he welcomed in that day that he screamed out that he'd rather work for the devil than his father. And it would be easy to say, well, he didn't mean it or he said it in anger, but he probably did mean it because that's when the demons came in. And it didn't, again, immediately occur where the possession happened like in the movies at that very moment, but the subtlety progressed quickly to where he was superhuman strength. And these demons were giving him power over his situation And I believe in those moments he loved it. I believe in those moments he felt like, now I have some power over my situation. And these are the lies that demons will tell us. And so if you're somebody who's listening to this podcast, remember that you have struggles. You know them, and the demons also know them. And those are the things that they will use to attack you, to tear you apart, and in some cases, to eventually possess you. And so how we counteract that is very basically put in the Bible. Is you cast your cares onto Jesus because he cares for you. You put those things on him. You take his burden, which is light, his yoke, and you give him yours. So when you find yourself in situations that seem overwhelming, or you've been through quote unquote hell and back, the false promises of a demon seem in the moment more tangible than the love and grace of God, but they come with massive consequences because they're lies. Jesus's love is tangible if you accept it. And when you do, you may not see the changes that you want immediately like you would if a demon possessed you and gave you strength. But you will see the transformation occur in a way that is glorious and beautiful, not detrimental to you in the end. And so, as you hear the story of Maurice, remember that the story of the nun uses this character, but there's not a direct correlation by any means. So, if you've heard that story and you stumbled upon this, I would suggest that you go back and just study this a little bit. Not in a way that we're glamorizing the paranormal and demons, but in a way that shows you how demons are methodically deconstructing people all over the place. And they're trying to do it to you as well. But if we would simply turn our lives to Jesus, accept this free gift of grace, this free gift of not only salvation, but a transformation of us, the beginning of becoming the person that you were designed to be. And that while you ebb and flow and you make more mistakes and you learn and fail, that he loves you enough to sit there with you and walk you through it step by step. Remember, you come as you are and he'll change you. You don't have to be perfect before you approach him. That's one of the many things I love about God. So I want to thank you for taking your time to tune into this bonus episode and for your contributions. It definitely helps to keep this on the air. So thank you so much. And I pray that God blesses you beyond measure this week and gives you peace.